In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the third-person narrative form and focus on some of the advantages of the third person over the first, as well as looking at some of the temptations and dangers it poses for the writer. I'll then go on to look at some of the different types of third-person narrators. But to begin with, I'd like to bring up a slide, if that's the right expression, I used in a previous lecture, which displays the major distinctions between first and third-person narrators. So, as I said before, as distinct from first-person narratives, third-person narratives are ones where the narrator talks about third persons, he's and she's. The narrator is outside the world of the story, and hence not a character in it. The narrator is usually thought of as omniscient and objective, but more of that in a moment. And this is useful to enter the worlds of lots of different characters, rather than simply focusing in on one. There are numerous advantages for the writer in using a third-person narrator. The third-person narrator is potentially completely free. The third-person narrator can go hundreds of years into the past or future, onto the moon or Mars, across galaxies, into the sky or to the bottom of the sea. There are no constraints. The third-person narrator potentially knows everything. On the other hand, if you have a first-person narrator, who is like one of the picaresque heroes of early Spanish fiction, that is a street urchin, beggar, and uneducated delinquent, you can't really put the words of a professor into his mouth, or the knowledge that a professor would have. And even if you have a clever first-person narrator, how do you get him to Mars, or 1,000 years into the past, and so on and so on? It might be possible, but you will have to construct some very artificial scenarios which may stretch the credulity of the reader and fracture their suspension of disbelief. You see this all the time in second-rate fiction, where, let's say, for plot purposes, the writer needs to let the reader know the thoughts of a secondary character. How do writers do this if the narrator hero doesn't know those thoughts? Well, the first-person narrator has to come across someone's diary or letters, or spy on them through a peephole, or listen to them through a keyhole. In third-person narratives, you don't have to bother with all that claptrap, because you have the freedom to stage the scene in the room with the other character. You are free to move back and forth between the protagonist and antagonist as you wish. There is, I think, an interesting analogy with cinema, as the camera is, of course, the third-person omniscient narrator of the cinematic world. So I'm going to play you a clip of my favourite film director, Alfred Hitchcock, talking about the differences between surprise and suspense.
Four people are sitting around a table, talking about baseball, whatever you like. 5 minutes of it, very dull. Suddenly, a bomb goes off, blows the people to smithereens. What do the audience have? 10 seconds of shock. Now take the same scene and tell the audience there is a bomb under that table and will go off in 5 minutes. Well, the whole emotion of the audience is totally different, because you've given them that information, that in 5 minutes' time, that bomb will go off. Now the conversation about baseball becomes very vital, because they're saying to you, don't be ridiculous, stop talking about baseball, there's a bomb under there. You've got the audience working.
How does this relate to narrative form? Well, hopefully it's obvious, but if not, I'll just spell it out. The camera in cinema acts as a kind of third-person narrator, telling the story for the audience, showing the viewer what the characters in the movie do not know or may be unaware of. So the camera can move under the table, show the bomb to the viewer, whilst the characters sitting around the table are blithely ignorant of the presence of the bomb. Now, if we're writing a story, and let's say we stick to this Hitchcock scenario where there's going to be a terrorist attack at a train station, then how would it pan out in the first person narrative? Well, let's imagine we have the hero narrator walking along to the train station, thinking about his day ahead, and when he gets there, a bomb goes off. Boom! The reader simply has a moment of surprise or shock. Because, of course, the first person narrator, the protagonist, would not be going to the station if he knew there was a bomb there, unless he had a death wish. No, he'd be calling the police or trying to warn the rail authorities or whatever, so that, they could clear the station. So our only convincing option for the scene is surprise. But in a third-person story, in which the narrator has total freedom, then we could present our scene in any number of ways. To get the audience working, in Hitchcock's words, then our omniscient third-person narrator would probably have spent the previous chapter with the terrorist group and shown them planting the explosives in the station. So in the third-person scenario, when our hero is rushing to the station to catch a train, thinking about his day ahead, the train journey, whether he'll have time to buy a newspaper to read on the train, whether he should buy the girl he's going to meet some flowers, looking at his watch, seeing if he's got enough time, wondering whether he should sacrifice the flowers or the reading pleasure. What we have for the reader when all this is happening is a completely different kind of experience. We have suspense. The reader is emotionally engaged as the reader's thinking, oh my God, don't go there, there's a bomb. Oh, let there be a queue in the flower shop so he doesn't reach the station. Oh my God, there's no queue and he's getting there and the bomb hasn't gone off. My God, what will happen? And having the reader do all that work for you, and having the reader so emotionally intertwined with the story is probably where you'd like to be as a writer. So the choice of narrative form can be key to giving your reader a particular kind of experience. Of course, there are dangers in using the third person. The third person narrator is almost by definition further removed from the reader than the first person. And the fact you have complete freedom makes third-person narrators a bit lazy, arrogant, and self-indulgent. If you can talk about anything, why not? Why not digress with your views on the latest political happenings, or your dislike of a particular type of woman or of man? Many writers do this, and so do the so-called great ones. Tolstoy notoriously stuck a 50-page digression on the theory of history into War and Peace. And on a much smaller scale, I had my own experience of this. I was recently redrafting a novel, and my agent asked me a question about one chapter. And the question was that terrible one for an author. Why does this need to be here? Now, in my story, the hero and heroine were going from Dublin to Donegal on the west coast of Ireland. And I had them stop in a town called Crossmaglen en route and walk around the square, where there is a statue, a monument to the IRA dead. And here's the statue, the phoenix, a symbol of the IRA rising from the ashes. Now, the reason I had the hero and heroine stop off in Crossmaglen was because it enabled me to go into a long, and I guess possibly lunatic rant about the history of Ireland. And this was in fact the only reason that the hero and heroine had stopped in that town. The agent quite simply asked, did it add anything to the story? And I had to confess, no, it didn't. I simply wanted to spout off. So I rather tearfully removed it from the second draft. Now, I'm not saying you should never rant. Remember, George Orwell said that sometimes this may be key to why you want to write. But do it with care. Beware the danger. Along with this is the problem that it's easier to tell than show. If you're not familiar with these concepts, don't worry. We'll talk about them later. But basically, unlike first-person narration, in which the narrator is actively engaged in the scene, third-person narrative tends to slip into, well, narration, reporting or telling the reader what happens or what people are thinking. Whereas rendering scenes with action and dialogue directly is showing and is more dramatic and intense. Now, there's no necessary clear-cut distinction between the first and third-person forms here, but the third person leans more easily towards tell, I think, than the first. And finally, there's the temptation to address the reader directly. Some writers do this. You'll have no doubt come across phrases such as dear reader, indulgent reader, constant reader, and so on. Now, some writers use this technique very well, and it's a deliberate part of the style. But the danger is, of course, you can interrupt the fictional world and destroy the reader's immersion in it. I've listed this as a danger of the third person, but more honestly, it should be listed as a danger to first-person narrators as well. It's just a general danger for a narrator. Now, just as a rider to that, of course, if you are Brecht, the great German playwright, or Godard, the great French-Swiss film director, you might deliberately want to fracture your audience's immersion in the fictional world as a political act, as a form of aesthetic subversion, and you in your writing may want to do this. But know why you are doing it, and if you do it, beware the danger, and know that you will be breaking the magic spell that captivates the reader and is the source of much of the reader's pleasure. Now, these guys can do it as they are aesthetic giants and political heroes, but can you? So beware of breaking the spell and interfering with the reader's pleasure, because as in real life, in fiction, pleasure is key. Anyhow, moving swiftly on from a potential digression about pleasure to types of third-person narrators, let's have a look at some of them. Historically, what is known as the omniscient narrator has been the most important kind. This was the narrator of the great 19th century realist novels, the chief exponent of whom was Tolstoy, think War and Peace, Anna Karenina, and maybe Flaubert, Madame Bovary being his most important novel. And then in the lower regions of the pantheon, we have one or two of our own exponents, our local girl, Mary Ann Evans, aka George Eliot, think Middlemarch, and of course the infamous scribbler Dickens. So let's have a look at what the master of the omniscient narrator, Leo Tolstoy, does in the opening chapters of Anna Karenina. We'll just take a look at a few excerpts.
Chapter 1. Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Everything was in confusion at the Oblonsky's house. The wife had discovered that the husband was carrying on an intrigue with a French girl who had been a governess in their family, and she had announced to her husband that she could not go on living in the same house with him. This position of affairs had now lasted 3 days, and not only the husband and wife themselves, but all the members of their family and household were painfully conscious of it.
So, the narrator sets the scene at the start. In chapter 2, the narrator then goes in and focuses on the husband.
Stepan Arkadyevitch was a truthful man in his relations with himself. He was incapable of deceiving himself and persuading himself that he repented of his conduct. He could not at this date repent of the fact that he, a handsome, susceptible man of 34, was not in love with his wife, the mother of 5 living and 2 dead children, and only a year younger than himself. All he repented of was that he had not succeeded in hiding it better from his wife. But he felt all the difficulty of his position, and was sorry for his wife, his children, and himself. Possibly he might have managed to conceal his sins better from his wife if he had anticipated that the knowledge of them would have had such an effect on her. He had never clearly thought out the subject, but he had vaguely conceived that his wife must long ago have suspected him of being unfaithful to her and shut her eyes to the fact. He had even supposed that she, a worn-out woman, no longer young or good-looking and in no way remarkable or interesting, merely a good mother, ought from a sense of fairness to take an indulgent view. It had turned out quite the other way.
Notice the narrator goes into the husband's mind and reports what he's thinking. Stepan is not repentant. He only wishes he hadn't been found out. He does feel sorry for his wife, but he was surprised at his wife's reaction to the affair. He thought that because she was old and worn out, she ought to have realised he couldn't be interested in her, and she should have allowed him to, what's the polite word, to make love with a younger woman. And he's shocked that she doesn't think this way. So clearly Stepan, besides being self-indulgent, selfish and hypocritical, despite his infidelities and knowledge in the biblical sense of many women, does not, the narrator is implying, know women well. Then the narrator moves into the world of the wife, and we see things from her perspective.
Darya Alexandrovna, in a dressing jacket, and with her now scanty, once luxuriant and beautiful hair fastened up with hairpins on the nape of her neck, with a sunken, thin face and large, startled eyes, which looked prominent from the thinness of her face, was standing among a litter of all sorts of things scattered all over the room, before an open bureau, from which she was taking something. Hearing her husband's steps, she stopped, looking toward the door, and trying assiduously to give her features a severe and contemptuous expression. She felt she was afraid of him, and afraid of the coming interview. She was just attempting to do what she had attempted to do 10 times already in the last 3 days, to sort out the children's things and her own, so as to take them to her mother's. And again, she could not bring herself to do this. But now, again, as each time before, she kept saying to herself that things cannot go on like this, that she must take some step to punish him, put him to shame, avenge on him some little part at least of the suffering he had caused her. She still continued to tell herself that she should leave him, but she was conscious that this was impossible. It was impossible because she could not get out of the habit of regarding him as her husband and loving him.
Now, neither the husband nor the wife are main characters in Anna Karenina, but we get to understand them as the narrator enters their world and tells us about them, how they see the world, how they feel and think, what they wish for and want to do. And then we move into the world of Levin and Vronsky and Anna and Karenin, etc., etc. The narrator wandering into the lives of the novel's inhabitants, each chapter or series of chapters focusing in on a different character. So, the omniscient narrator, the puppet master of the fictional world. Tolstoy is the archetype, though there are many more. Tolstoy regarded his fictional world as a kind of fish tank in which the author-narrator could look down, godlike, on the world of his characters, an all-seeing eye who could focus in on any character and move to another whenever he liked. And here's a picture of Shirley Crabtree as the Tolstoyan narrator is what I'd call the Big Daddy narrator, this omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent narrator. His words are always true. You trust the narrator so much you could not dream of questioning him. He's the god of the fictional world, the omniscient eye that knows everything. Now, you'll sometimes hear the term objective narrator used in some sort of counter-distinction to omniscient. I think the term objective is misleading, as the omniscient narrator is also thought of as being objective. I prefer to use the term distant or removed, in that, unlike in the case of Tolstoy, these distant or removed narrators refuse to enter the minds of their characters and tell you what the characters are thinking. They just show us what they do and say. You see this in the stories of Ernest Hemingway and Raymond Carver. And this narrative position is perhaps epitomised in James Joyce's phrase of the artist as being distant from the world of his fiction, not present, removed, indifferent, sitting somewhere else, paring his fingernails. The complete opposite, if you like, of Henry Miller's direct, personal, committed first-person voice in Tropic of Cancer. Now, let's have a look at an example of a distant narrator, one who refuses to explain or interpret the narrative world for us. The most extreme example is probably Ernest Hemingway. Take Hills Like White Elephants. This is a very short story set at a railway station, and a couple are simply waiting for a train. Nothing is happening, they're just killing time. So it's, shall we have a beer? Yes, let's have a beer. Make it a big one. Yeah, let's have a big one. Blah-de-blah, blah. And I mean, nothing at all is happening. And the girl looks across the horizon and says she thinks the hills in the distance look like white elephants. And then we have this following extraordinary conversation.
The warm wind blew the bead curtains against the table. "The beer's nice and cool," the man said. "It's lovely," the girl said. "It's really an awfully simple operation, Jig," the man said. "It's not really an operation at all." The girl looked at the ground the table legs rested on. "I know you wouldn't mind it, Jig. It's really not anything. It's just to let the air in." The girl did not say anything. "I'll go with you and I'll stay with you all the time. They just let the air in and then it's all perfectly natural." "Then what will we do afterward?" "We'll be fine afterward, just like we were before." "What makes you think so?" "That's the only thing that bothers us. It's the only thing that made us unhappy." The girl looked at the bead curtain, put her hand out and took hold of two of the strings of beads. "And you think then we'll be all right and be happy?" "I know we will. You don't have to be afraid. I've known lots of people that have done it." "So have I," said the girl, "and afterwards they're all so happy." "Well," the man said, "if you don't want to, you don't have to. I wouldn't have you do it if you didn't want to, but I know it's perfectly simple." "And you really want to?" "I think it's the best thing to do. But I don't want you to do it if you don't really want to." "And if I do it, you'll be happy and things will be like they were and you'll love me." "I love you now. You know I love you." "I know, but if I do it, then it will be nice again. If I say things are like white elephants and you like it." "I love it. I love it now, but I just can't think about it."
Notice that the author never explains what the characters are talking about. We, the readers, don't know. We have to infer or guess or work it out somehow. Now, of course, it would be artificial for the characters to inform the reader of the subtext of or background to their conversation, as they, of course, unlike us, already know what it is. So no one tells us. The narrator doesn't help. He absolutely refuses to go inside the minds of the man and woman and tell us what they are thinking and feeling. We can only work it out from what they say and do, and more peripherally from some clues given to us in the story title, the setting, the imagery, and some key aspects of the language. Now, to me, the unspoken subtext is of pregnancy, and the man is trying to convince the girl to go ahead with an abortion. That's the operation referred to. They are waiting at a station as they have not decided what to do. The setting is symbolic, of course, a station, a place of waiting, and what is pregnancy, if not on one level, a period of waiting, a caesura, a pause between two states. And the title of the story, which is the phrase the girl uses to describe the hills, the bump on the landscape, if you like, is terribly significant and poignant. For the white elephant, the unacknowledged center of their dialogue is the fetus, this baby in the making that has changed everything between them and will change everything afterwards. And so the elephant in the room, that most important thing that cannot be spoken about, is the unborn child. And what is a white elephant after all but a precious but burdensome thing that is difficult to get rid of and ruins the owner? And if interpreted in this light, the story becomes terribly powerful and desperately sad, as the very different perspectives of the young man and women are laid bare. He wants to have an abortion, She is unsure. She only wants him to love her. He only wants rid of the child. So this is a story about dreams, about broken dreams, about the intimate relationship between a man and a woman, about life and death, about the failure of love, about callousness, selfishness, about desire and loss. And it's possibly one of the saddest stories ever written. There is no hope here. But we have to work hard as readers, because unlike Tolstoy, Hemingway gives us nothing, or almost nothing. I've read this story to students and seen the bemused looks on their faces as they don't register a thing. And I'm not blaming the students, or casting them as stupid, or certainly as no more stupid than I am, for that's how I felt when I first read the story. Confused, what's going on, is it this, is it that? It was only on the second reading that I began to make sense of it, that things started to click. So this is very brave writing. You've got to be good as a writer to get away with this level of understatement, of being this far removed. And you've got to be tough to refuse the temptation to baby a reader and explain everything to them.
So if Tolstoy is the big daddy narrator, controlling and directing the attention of the reader, then Hemingway is the silent father, cold and distant, opening a window onto the world, true enough, but refusing to interpret it for us, allowing the reader the freedom to make her own judgment, but withdrawing his hand from the child. Let's go on to unreliable narrators. There are, of course, unreliable first-person narrators. Think of the protagonist of Poe's The Telltale Heart. But given first-person narratives are by their nature subjective, limited to the perspective of one character, then unreliability is no more difficult to understand than in one's relations in real life. There are just some people we do not trust. But if we think about unreliable third-person narrators, because they operate non-diegetically, that is, they exist outside the world of the story, and hence occupy a position akin to that of a structuring principle or a god. So it is more philosophically problematic to experience an unreliable third-person narrator than an unreliable first, and this can have effects on the reader. And I'll say a bit more about this at a later date. Now, an unreliable third-person narrator is diametrically opposed to the Tolstoyan narrator, the narrator you can trust to explain everything and tell you the truth about the fictional world, the objective, omniscient God. I like to think of the unreliable narrator as the dark, hidden counterpart of the Tolstoyan narrator, a playful, cowardly, comical, and trustworthy satanic narrator, a two-faced Janus, pretending to be one thing, but actually being another. And my favourite of this type is the narrator of Patrick Susskind's Perfume. Let's have a little bit. Now, I should just say that this part of the story contains dialogue between an aging and decrepit owner of a perfume shop, Baldini, and his aging servant, Chenier. The business is failing badly due to Baldini's incompetence as a perfumier and due to the skill of his competitor, Pélissier. Once the dialogue in the extract has finished, take careful note of the narrative voice.
Chenier? Baldini cried from behind the counter, where for hours he had stood rigid as a pillar staring at the door. Put on your wig! And out from among the kegs of olive oil and dangling Bayonne hams appeared Chenier, Baldini's assistant, somewhat younger than the latter, but already an old man himself, and moved towards the elegant front of the shop. He pulled his wig from his coat pocket and shoved it on his head. "Are you going out, Monsieur Baldini?" "No," said Baldini. "I shall retire to my study for a few hours, and I do not wish to be disturbed under any circumstances." "Ah, I see. You are creating a new perfume." "Correct. With which to impregnate a Spanish hide for Count Veramont. He wants something completely new. He has asked for something like... I think he said it was called Amor and Psyche, and comes, he says, from that bungler in the Rue Saint-André-des-Arts, Pélissier? Yes, indeed. That's the bungler's name, Amor and Psyche by Pélissier. Do you know it?
Yes, I do indeed. You can smell it everywhere these days. Smell it on every street corner. But if you ask me, nothing special. It most certainly can't be compared in any way with what you will create, Monsieur Baldini.
Naturally not.
It's a terribly common scent, this Amor and Psyche.
Vulgar?
Oh, totally vulgar, like everything from Pélissier. I believe it contains lime oil.
Really? What else?
Essence of orange blossom, perhaps? And maybe tincture of rosemary, but I can't say for sure.
It's of no consequence at all to me in any case.
Naturally not.
I could not care less what that bungler Pélissier slumps into his perfumes. I certainly would not take my inspiration from him, I assure you.
You're absolutely right, monsieur.
As you know, I take my inspiration from no one. As you know, I create my own perfumes.
I do know, monsieur.
I alone give birth to them.
I know.
And I am thinking of creating something for Count Veramont that will cause a veritable furore.
I am sure it will, Monsieur Baldini.
Take charge of the shop. I need peace and quiet. Don't let anyone near me, Chenier. And with that he shuffled away, not at all like a statue, but as befitted his age, bent over, but so far that he looked almost as if he had been beaten, and slowly climbed the stairs to his study on the second floor. Chenier took his place behind the counter, positioning himself exactly as his master had stood before, and stared fixedly at the door. He knew what would happen in the next few hours. Absolutely nothing in the shop, and up in Baldini's study, the usual catastrophe. Baldini would take off his blue coat, drenched in frangipani, sit down at his desk, and wait for inspiration. The inspiration would not come. He would then hurry over to the cupboard with its hundreds of vials and start mixing them haphazardly. The mixture would be a failure. He would curse, fling open the window, and pour the stuff into the river. He would try something else. That too would be a failure. He would then rave and rant and throw a howling fit there in the stifling, odour-filled room. At about 7 o'clock he would come back down, miserable, trembling and whining, and say, "Chenier, I've lost my nose. I cannot give birth to this perfume. I cannot deliver the Spanish hide to the Count. All is lost. I am dead inside. I want to die. Chenier, please help me die." And Chenier would suggest that someone be sent to Pélissier's for a bottle of Amor and Psyche, and Baldini would acquiesce, but only on condition that not a soul should learn of his shame. Chenier would swear himself to silence, and tonight they would perfume Count Veramont's leather with the other man's product. That was how it would be, no doubt of it, and Chenier only wished that the whole circus were already over. Baldini was no longer a great perfumer. At one time, to be sure, in his youth, 30, 40 years ago, he had composed Rose of the South and Baldini's Gallant Bouquet, the two truly great perfumes to which he owed his fortune. But now he was old and exhausted, and did not know current fashions and modern tastes, and whenever he did manage to concoct a new perfume of his own, it was some totally old-fashioned, unmarketable stuff that within a year they had to dilute 10 to 1 and peddle as an additive for fountains. What a shame, Chenier thought as he checked the sit of his wig in the mirror. A shame about old Baldini. A shame about his beautiful shop, because he's sure to ruin it. And a shame about me, because by the time he has ruined it, I'll be too old to take it over. Giuseppe Baldini had indeed taken off his redolent coat, but only out of long-standing habit. The odour of frangipani had long since ceased to interfere with his ability to smell. He had carried it about with him for decades now, and he no longer noticed it at all. And although he had closed the doors to his study and asked for peace and quiet, he had not sat down at his desk to ponder and wait for inspiration, for he knew far better than Chenier that inspiration would not strike. After all, it never had before. He was old and exhausted, that much was true, and was no longer a great perfumer. But he knew that he had never in his life been one. He had inherited Rose of the South from his father, and the formula for Baldini's gallant bouquet had been bought from a travelling Genoese spice salesman. The rest of his perfumes were old, familiar blends. He had never invented anything. He was not an inventor. He was a careful producer of traditional scents. He was like a cook who runs a great kitchen with a routine and good recipes, but has never created a dish of his own.
Right, so here's the author, Patrick Suskind, looking suitably intellectual and Germanic. And let's just take a look at two brief excerpts from the previous passage we heard. In the first excerpt, we can see that the third-person narrator tells us a fact about the perfumier Baldini. Baldini was no longer a great perfumer. At one time, to be sure, in his youth, 30, 40 years ago, he had composed Rose of the South and Baldini's Gallant Bouquet, the two truly great perfumes to which he owed his fortune. So the narrator states quite plainly that Baldini had once produced great perfumes. And he tells us this when he is alone with Chenier. But a little later, when the narrator is alone with Baldini, he tells us something quite different. He was old and no longer a great perfumer, but he knew that he had never in his life been one. He had inherited Rose of the South from his father, and the formula for Baldini's Gallant Bouquet had been bought from a travelling Genoese spice salesman. The rest of his perfumes were old familiar blends. He had never invented anything. So here, quite clearly, the narrator states that Baldini had never produced a great perfume. So we have two contradictory statements given to us by the narrator, two completely incompatible versions of the past. This would never happen in Tolstoy. This is no conventional omniscient narrator. What we have here is a different kind of narrator, one who can't be relied on, who seems restricted in his outlook to the character he's focusing on, rather than existing as an objective outsider. And I'll say a little bit more about this type of narrator in a future lecture when looking at the writing of Stephen King. Let's take a look at another example of an unreliable narrator, very much a satirical one, in something I've written. So, Oscar Edmund is a story about a slightly worn and degenerate university lecturer, but nevertheless a bit of a revolutionary hero, who goes into battle with his nemesis, the evil, despicable, manipulative and Machiavellian head of department, Professor Helen Highwater. And of course, as in all true stories, the hero loses. Here's a description of Helen Highwater in action, her work consisting of electronic spying on the departmental staff. Professor Helen Highwater added a pinch of salt to her watery porridge oats and sat down at her kitchen table for her Sunday morning breakfast. Being both professor and head of department at one of the most prestigious universities in the UK, she was, of course, much too busy to indulge in ingestion without industry. Hence, a laptop and a black A4 file were placed either side of her breakfast bowl, and she worked as she ate. Professor Highwater sucked the lukewarm watery liquid through the plastic straw she preferred to use to conventional cutlery when in her own company, and stared with a suitably serious expression at her computer screen as she prepared to continue the work she had begun the previous evening, work which had kept her busy until the early hours of the morning. Criticise as one might, and some did, the good lady professor, but let no one say she was not a devoted servant of the university, and did not deserve every penny of her appropriately large remuneration. If a human observer had had the privileged position afforded to the big blue blowfly, which sat patiently at the edge of the professor's table, rubbing its legs together and watching and waiting for a taste of the remnants of her breakfast bowl, then he or she would have seen the whole gamut of human emotions cross the lady's visage during her petit déjeuner. As she stared at the computer screen, curiosity, anger, anxiety, and joy were etched from one moment to the next across her face. But what held the blue bottle back from venturing forth in search of morning repast, despite the pangs of hunger that gnawed at its stomach, was the look that stayed on the professor's face the longest, for it was the expression of pleasure, the pleasure of a spider contemplating its prey, that cowed the beating heart of the insect and kept it perched on the edge of the breakfast table, tantalizingly close to, but nevertheless beyond reach of its desired goal. Oscar Redman's email account lay fully exposed, like a rape victim before the greedy eyes of the abuser. Not only was Professor Highwater able to read the full contents of both his current and archived account, but the university had kindly acceded to her request to restore all Oscar's deleted messages, so she was also able to penetrate the dark and murky recesses of what Oscar naively assumed had disappeared into the virtual ether. The professor was justifiably irritated by the fact that the incompetents in IT had only been able to restore mail that had been deleted in the last 3 months. But despite this regrettable minor disappointment, she could not help but be overjoyed, for Oscar Redman's email account was a veritable treasure trove of information, an open-cast mine where diamonds, precious metals, and golden nuggets lay strewn across the landscape. It was all so much better than she had expected. The fool lacked any sense of caution. He used his work account as if it were his own personal one, as if it belonged to him rather than to the university. Not only did he make jokes, use foul and racist language, disparage the university to academics overseas, abuse and mock his colleagues, and his head of department in particular, but he was also encouraging his students to be terrorists and exchanging dirty sex messages with his filthy little whore, not to mention the links to pornographic sites. Oscar Redman had absolutely no restraint whatsoever. The professor let out a happy chuckle. It was simply too good to be true. The sound of her own laughter acted as an oral reminder and a reprimand. The professor must not get carried away in the delight of the moment. There was serious work to be done. Helen opened the thick black A4 file that lay to the right of her porridge bowl and picked up a pen. She ran her fingers down the cardboard dividers showing the names of Dell staff members and selected the one labelled White, Peter. She looked again at her computer containing an email exchange between Doctors Redman and White and carefully wrote something down in the file. Once she had finished writing, she turned back the pages of the file until she came to the divider labelled Gonzalez Maria. Again she consulted her computer, and again she wrote something down. Helen sucked up the final dregs of cold porridge from the bottom of her cereal bowl, and, much to the disappointment of the observing fly, proceeded to vacuum around the edges of the ceramic dish with her straw. She pushed the receptacle aside in order to give herself more space and turned to the file section marked Redman, Oscar. It was by far the thickest section of the file, and Professor Highwater had to turn over many pages before she came to a blank space. She looked again at the computer and then wrote something down before giving a sigh. So much information, so much endless work. She had begun the file before she had arrived as head of department at Dell, and the divider labelled Redman, Oscar had been the first one she had created. But now there was a section for every member of staff, and there were entries under every name. But even so, all the other entries together barely took up as much space as did the arrogant bastards. In terms of the black book, as she unconsciously termed her file, Dr. Redman had not proved a disappointment. But then it came to her in a flash, in a sudden, joyful, but nevertheless troubling epiphany. There was no longer any need to write new entries on Dr. Oscar Redman. He was already history. Professor Highwater's overwhelming sense of triumph was tinged with just a hint of nostalgic sadness at the thought of loss of an activity that had given her much pleasure over the past 9 months. Nevertheless, the realization that the section on Redman could soon be transferred to a new file entitled Ex-Dell Staff Members was sufficient in the professor's mind to justify a little break. It was a lovely day. Perhaps she should go for a walk before church. Helen Highwater closed the file, stood up, and went to the window. Yes, she would take a little stroll in the sunshine. It was good for the constitution. She returned to the table to clear away the dishes. Alongside her cereal bowl, a fat, filthy fly was perched on the end of her straw, pushing its proboscis into the tiny remnants of porridge encrusted along the outside of the plastic tube. How disgusting. The creature, immersed as it was in its banquet of cold porridge, saliva and vomit, saw a fraction too late the hand of fate come down from above. Day turned to night as the insect felt its face collapse, its stomach explode, and its tiny brain blow out of its ears. Professor Highwater felt an unpleasant splat sensation as blue and purple turned to red and black, and her hand was stained with a minute spot of blood. She flicked the tiny bits of broken legs and torso from her fist and wiped her hand on her trousers. She took the bowl and the straw into the kitchen and left them soaking in the sink. She switched off her laptop, checked the downstairs windows, put on a thin nylon jacket, and went out the back door, taking care to double lock it, as was her wont. A gentle summer's breeze was dancing through the trees. It really was a lovely day for a walk. Rather like the narrator in Perfume, this is an unreliable narrator, one who tends to slip into the voice and attitude of the character he is focusing on, though one that ironizes the events by presenting quite awful things innocently, but only apparently non-judgmentally, because the voice is actually a satirical one, insofar as the reader is left with a disjuncture between events and the way they are reported. And this gap, albeit one the reader has to fill, is the realm of satire. And here's the author looking suitably unreliable. Finally, there is what we term the third-person subjective narrator, of which incidentally our previous unreliable narrators are examples. And you will sometimes hear these referred to as restricted narrators, or over-the-shoulder narrators, or you might hear quasi-direct narration, or even indirect freestyle. Essentially, this is where you have a third-person narrator who tends to stick with one character. The most famous example being the narrator of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. But I'll say more about that on another occasion when we take a look at a story of Stephen King's. There are also various hybrid forms, and if you're interested in a clever example, read Dostoevsky's The Devils, which is sometimes called The Possessed. In The Devils, the first-person narrator is such an insignificant character that the story slips for the most part into third-person form, occasionally returning to the first person when the narrator re-enters the story for brief periods as a character, rather like my video persona has done today. And if you're wondering why the video narrator sounds and looks like this, put it down to an experiment in alternative personas. This morning, I'm experimenting with the post-Saturday night out on the town, Sunday morning, hungover, degenerate Bukowskian writer. And it's taken a considerable leap of the imagination to inhabit such an alien position this Sunday morning. Till next time.